We're going to try and take that line of thinking and apply it to a proof. So what we want to prove here is that if the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then the parallelogram must be a rhombus, okay? So given in this case, we have this ABCD parallelogram. They also tell us that AC is perpendicular to BD, so it's right here, right? The diagonals are perpendicular, that's the whole point, right? And they want us to prove that based on what we know that ABCD is a rhombus. And so the first thing you want to think is, well, what is a rhombus? A rhombus is just all sides are congruent, right? It's a quadrilateral with 4 congruent sides. So that's what we need to show. If we can show that all 4 sides are congruent, then we can show that it's a rhombus. So now what's your strategy? What you should be thinking is, how do we normally show that sides are congruent? Typically what we do is we show that shapes, usually triangles, are congruent. And then once we can prove that shapes are congruent, then we know that all of their corresponding parts are congruent. And so I look at the diagram, I see a whole bunch of triangles, and so I start thinking that's probably the right path for this example. So I'm just going to dive in, and sometimes you don't know exactly how you're going to end up figuring it out, right? And that's fine. So just go through your paragraph, start keeping track of what you know is true, and see if you get enough along the way to prove that some of these triangles are congruent. So we know that ABCD is a parallelogram. And since it's a parallelogram, I know, I'm going to switch the colors right here real quick. I know that the diagonals bisect each other. So I know that BD, or BX, excuse me, is the same as XD. And I know that AX is the same as CX, right? So ABCD is a parallelogram, so AX is congruent to CX, and BX is congruent to DX. Okay, so I have those. Okay, also, if this is a right angle, then I know that that's also a right angle, because these are all supplementary. I know that that's a right angle, right? We learned a long time ago that if you have an intersection and one of the angles is a right angle, then all 4 are right angles. So also, we can say, we'll say this one, right? DXC, our angle, and D angle BXC are congruent right angles, or just both right angles, right? So they're congruent, both right angles. Okay, so now let's kind of just take a step back and look what we know, right? If I look at these 2 triangles over here, that one, look at the green triangle, and I'll look at the blue triangle. Okay, look what I have. I know that I have an angle, a side, and another side, and angle in the middle. So I know by side, angle, side, that those 2 triangles are congruent. So I know that triangle DXC is congruent to triangle, let's match it up correctly, BXC, because of side, angle, side, right? And so if those 2 triangles are congruent, then I know that all of their corresponding sides are the same, right? So I know that, for instance, BC is the same as DC. Okay, so therefore, I'm going to say therefore, or just say BC is congruent to DC. And that's because of corresponding, and like you could also write your reason in just a parenthesis, right? You could say because the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, okay? And so now at this point, if I know those triangles are congruent, and I know that BC is congruent to DC, right? But I also know that BC is congruent to AD because that's a parallelogram, and I know that DC is congruent to AB. So now I know that all 4 sides are congruent, right? So we know that, therefore, AD is congruent to AB, is congruent to DC, is congruent to BC. And you could say because the transitive property. Okay? And since all four sides are congruent, you know it's a rhombus. So the shape ABCD must be a rhombus. Okay? So the key there is the overall strategy. If you get stuck in the little nuts and bolts, that's fine. But the big idea you should be able to think through, right? You should have thought right away, I need to show this as a rhombus. So I need to show that all four sides are congruent. That's one. Two, I need to show that the sides are congruent. So I'm probably going to have to show that these shapes, these triangles are congruent. And then I'll be able to use congruent parts if congruent triangles are congruent to show that all of those segments are congruent. And then once I can do that, I can show that all of the sides are congruent and that it's a rhombus.